The morning of December 7th, 1941, began like any other Sunday. Across America, factories were silent, families gathered around breakfast tables, and newspapers spoke of a distant war. Then came the shock from the Pacific. Pearl Harbor burned, battleships sank, and a stunned nation stared into the smoke of history changing before its eyes. In that moment, America's slumbering industries stirred. From Detroit's automotive lines to Pittsburgh's steel mills, a quiet resolve spread faster than the news itself. President Roosevelt's voice echoed across radios that evening, declaring it a date which will live in infamy. But behind his words, something else began. The greatest mobilization of industry the modern world had ever seen. Assembly lines that once rolled out sedans and refrigerators would soon produce tanks, bombers, and bullets by the billions. It was not just a shift in production. It was a transformation of purpose. Engineers, mechanics, housewives, and students, all would soon be soldiers of steel and sweat. No one yet knew how long the war would last or how costly it would be. But the call had been sounded. The factories of America would become its arsenal, a vast, humming army of machines that would turn defeat into victory. By early 1942, Roosevelt had given the nation a new mission, to become the arsenal of democracy. It wasn't a slogan, it was a command. America's survival depended on it. Every industrial town became a battlefield of productivity. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler stopped making cars altogether. Instead, they produced tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, an enormous facility built from empty farmland, became the world's largest factory under a single roof. Inside, workers turned out the B-24 Liberator bomber, a four-engine giant that had once taken weeks to build. By 1944, Willow Run was producing one every 63 minutes. The air smelled of hot oil, and the thunder of rivet guns never ceased. Men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, often through the night, driven by patriotism, duty, and sometimes pure exhaustion. Factories became temples of national pride. "We're not making cars anymore," said one Detroit foreman. "We're making history." The lifeblood of war was steel, and the men of the steel towns knew it. Pittsburgh's skyline glowed orange at night, its furnaces roaring like dragons. Iron ore from Minnesota's Mesabi Range flowed into mills that worked 24 hours a day. Workers endured brutal heat and long shifts. Many were too old or unfit for military service, but too proud to stand aside. They saw every glowing ingot as their contribution to victory. A single ton of steel could become 10 rifles, or a tank's armor plate, or the hull of a destroyer slicing through the Atlantic. Accidents were common, burns frequent. Yet production soared. Between 1940 and 1945, America produced more steel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The war could not be won without courage, and not all of it was found on the front lines. Across the ocean, Allied supply lines were under siege. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. America's answer came not from admirals, but from shipbuilders. The Liberty Ship program, conceived by industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, changed everything. These cargo vessels were built to be simple, strong, and fast to produce. At the start, it took nearly 200 days to build one. But by 1943, some shipyards could launch a new Liberty ship every 5 days. At Kaiser's Richmond Yard in California, welders replaced rivets with molten steel seams, cutting production time in half. Men and women worked side by side, some fresh from farms, others from offices, all learning as they went. Each launch became a local celebration. Bands played, crowds cheered, and names of loved ones were painted on hulls. Over 2,700 Liberty ships would sail before war's end. The silent carriers of freedom, hauling food, tanks, and hope across oceans of danger. When millions of men left for battlefields overseas, America faced another kind of shortage: manpower. The answer came from a force few had expected: women. Factories that once barred them now hung banners reading, "Women wanted." And they came. Secretaries, mothers, students, farmers' wives, trading dresses for coveralls and lipstick for welding goggles. They learned fast. They worked hard. And they changed the nation forever. Rosie the Riveter became their symbol. Strong, determined, smiling beneath a red bandana. At the Douglas Aircraft Plant in California, women assembled wings for bombers that would soon roar over Europe. In shipyards, they welded steel plates that would carry soldiers to Normandy. Many worked 12-hour shifts, caring for children at night and returning to the line at dawn. They were not soldiers, yet they fought in their own way, against fatigue, doubt, and the expectations of an old world. By 1944, nearly 1 in 3 American workers was a woman. Their labor didn't just fill gaps, it proved a truth long denied, that courage wears many faces. War breeds necessity, and necessity breeds invention. America's scientists, engineers, and inventors formed the hidden battalions of the war effort. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, radar technology evolved from experiment to essential weapon. In Bell Labs, research teams built communication systems that kept entire armies connected. Engineers at Boeing, Lockheed, and North American Aviation turned design sketches into flying legends. The B-17, Flying Fortress, the P-51 Mustang, the P-38 Lightning, the Manhattan Project, cloaked in secrecy, represented science pushed beyond imagination. Thousands of scientists worked in silence, their work unknown even to their families. When their discovery finally revealed itself in 1945, it would alter the world forever. But innovation wasn't only found in labs. On factory floors, workers improvised solutions to keep lines moving. A broken machine might be fixed with a wrench and wire. A new tool might be invented on the spot. The war demanded not perfection, but persistence. By 1943, the air war had become the crucible of modern conflict. To win it, America needed planes, thousands of them. From California to New York, aircraft plants grew like steel cathedrals. Boeing's workers in Seattle turned out B-17s by the hundreds. In Burbank, Lockheed's sprawling facility produced the lightning-fast P-38. North, American Aviation's plant in Inglewood built the P-51 Mustang, a fighter so elegant and deadly that it changed the course of the war in Europe. Each aircraft bore the fingerprints of hundreds of workers. Riveters, machinists, and test pilots labored around the clock. Even as fatigue set in, the hum of engines kept them going. "Every plane we finish," said one mechanic, "means fewer boys die over there." By the war's end, the U.S. had produced over 300,000 aircraft, an industrial miracle that gave wings to freedom itself. No army can fight without food, fuel, and ammunition. Behind every frontline hero stood a vast machine of logistics, trucks, trains, and ships that kept the war alive. The Army Quartermaster Corps oversaw the movement of millions of tons of supplies. Trains crisscrossed the continent, hauling tanks to ports. Convoys stretched across oceans, guarded by destroyers and aircraft. Engineers built pipelines under the English Channel to fuel the invasion of Europe. Factories produced not just weapons, but uniforms, boots, bandages, and rations. The humble K-ration, packed in small cardboard boxes, became the soldier's lifeline in jungles, deserts, and frozen forests. From the factory floor to the foxhole, America's supply chain was a miracle of coordination. It was not glamorous, but it was essential. Logistics, Roosevelt once said, wins wars, and America had mastered it like no other nation in history. By 1942, America had transformed itself into something almost unrecognizable. The nation that once struggled through the Great Depression now pulsed with new life, every city humming, every hand needed. Nearly 17 million new civilian jobs were created during the war, pulling men and women from farms, offices, and schools into a massive industrial army. In small towns, posters cried out, "Do the job he left behind." Across the Midwest, freight trains thundered past dawn horizons loaded with coal, iron, and lumber. In New York, the docks became forests of cranes, loading cargo bound for the farthest corners of war. Even Hollywood joined the mobilization. Studios released films urging citizens to buy war bonds, conserve metal, and collect scrap. Children gathered tin cans and rubber tires for recycling. Housewives saved bacon grease to make explosives. It wasn't propaganda. It was unity. In just a few short years, America's economy doubled in size. Government contracts turned factories into arsenals, and small workshops became vital cogs in the war machine. By 1943, nearly two-thirds of the U.S. economy was devoted entirely to the war effort. Every whistle that blew at dawn, every smokestack that lit up the sky, reminded the world Detroit had long been the Motor City, but by 1942 it had become the engine of freedom. The automobile capital of the world was now a fortress of industry, where every piston, every bolt, and every wheel played a role in the war. Ford's Willow Run produced bombers. General Motors built tanks and engines. Chrysler turned out military trucks. The city's familiar skyline of smokestacks became symbols of defiance against tyranny. In one of the most striking transformations, the Chrysler tank arsenal in Warren, Michigan, switched from producing sedans to M4 Sherman tanks almost overnight. The assembly line that once delivered family cars now rolled out armored beasts ready for the deserts of North Africa and the hedgerows of France. Mechanics and engineers who once argued over chrome, finishes now debated turret rotations and gun calibers. And when the first tank rumbled off the line, workers gathered around it in silence, realizing that their hands had just built a weapon that could change the course of history. By 1945, Detroit's factories had produced 97,000 tanks, 27,000 aircraft engines, and countless trucks and jeeps. No general could have fought without Detroit's muscle. The city had become what journalists called the arsenal's beating heart. For every gleaming aircraft or thunderous tank, there stood faces few ever saw. The machinists who shaved metal to a hair's width, the welders who worked by sparks and shadows, the inspectors who caught flaws before they could cost lives. They came from every background. Coal miners from Pennsylvania, farmers from Iowa, immigrants from Poland and Italy, Black Americans from the South seeking new opportunity in northern cities. Together, they formed the most diverse workforce in U.S. history. Segregation still scarred the nation, but war demanded unity. Factories could no longer afford prejudice. The Fair Employment Practices Committee pushed industries to hire without discrimination, a small step toward equality born of necessity. In Detroit, one African-American welder recalled, "We worked side by side. Maybe we didn't always like each other, but when you're under that heat, building something for your boys overseas, you forget who's who." Every worker had a reason. A brother in Italy, a son in the Pacific, a husband lost at sea. And so they kept the machines running, not for pay, not for pride, but for victory. What set America apart wasn't just manpower, it was method. The U.S. had perfected the science of mass production long before the war began. Henry Ford's assembly line had revolutionized industry, and now that same logic fueled wartime efficiency. Factories became living organisms. Conveyor belts carried parts from one end to the other. Specialists repeated tasks thousands of times a day, each motion measured, each second saved. At North American Aviation, assembly lines were so optimized that a B-25 bomber could be produced in less than 2 weeks. At the Higgins Industries shipyard in New Orleans, small boats, vital for amphibious assaults, were turned out in endless streams. These were the landing crafts that would carry Allied soldiers to Omaha Beach on D-Day. Behind this miracle lay logistics, warehouses of spare parts, rail networks moving materials seamlessly, and teams of planners mapping out the movement of every screw and bolt. It was order from chaos, a mechanical symphony that ran day and night. By 1944, the U.S. had produced more weapons than all Axis powers combined. The result wasn't coincidence. It was the culmination of decades of innovation, planning, and a spirit that refused to rest. Steel and bullets weren't enough. The soldiers who stormed beaches and crossed deserts needed something equally vital: food. American agriculture answered the call. Farms across the Midwest roared to life with wartime urgency. Tractors replaced horses, and production of wheat, corn, and meat soared. Women and teenagers joined the effort, forming the Women's Land Army, tilling fields and harvesting crops while the men fought overseas. Canned goods, dehydrated vegetables, and powdered milk became essential military rations. The K-ration, developed for paratroopers, packed a full meal into a small box: biscuits, meat, chocolate, and cigarettes. Millions of them were produced monthly. Meanwhile, food factories learned to preserve supplies longer, ship them faster, and waste nothing. On the home front, Victory Gardens appeared in every neighborhood, citizens growing their own vegetables to ease the burden on the supply chain. It was another kind of front line: quiet, green, and full of hope. As one farmer put it, "We're not fighting with guns, but our plows feed the ones who do." Victory didn't come cheap. Every bullet, every tank, every plane cost money, and America turned to its citizens to pay the bill. War bonds became a patriotic duty. Celebrities like Bing Crosby and Rita Hayworth toured the country, urging crowds to buy bonds. Children emptied their piggy banks. Families saved every spare dollar. Billboards declared, "If you can't go to war, help pay for it." By the war's end, Americans had purchased over $185 billion in bonds, a staggering figure that united rich and poor in a single cause, but sacrifice went far beyond money. Rationing became a daily reality. Gasoline, sugar, and rubber were strictly limited. Housewives lined up for hours with ration books in hand. Blackout drills darkened coastal cities to guard against submarine attacks. Through it all, morale stayed strong. The hardship was a reminder that freedom demanded endurance. As one poster read, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." Every major Allied victory was backed by American industry. In North Africa, General Patton's tanks, born from Detroit steel, rolled through desert sands. In Europe, the B-17 bombers that crippled German factories came from the hands of Midwest mechanics. In the Pacific, the aircraft carriers and landing crafts that island-hopped from Tarawa to Okinawa were built in American shipyards. The Jeep, simple and sturdy, became the soldier's best friend, a symbol of mobility and reliability. The numbers were staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. built 86,000 tanks, 297,000 aircraft, 8,000 naval vessels, and 2.5 million trucks. Germany and Japan could not keep pace. Industrial might had become a weapon in itself. Every American factory, every welder's spark, every train whistle carrying supplies, they were all part of the same offensive. The front lines were not just in Europe or the Pacific. They ran through Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago. The machines may have won battles, but it was people who bore the weight of the war. On the assembly lines, fatigue was constant. Injuries were common. Thousands collapsed from overwork, but production never stopped. Letters from soldiers hung on bulletin boards, reminders of why they labored. Mothers who built bombers sometimes received news that their sons had died in planes just like the ones they helped create. The connection was heartbreaking, yet they returned to work the next day, determined that others might live. When the war finally began to turn in 1944, the factories didn't slow down. They roared louder than ever. The men and women behind the machines knew that each finished weapon brought the world one step closer to peace. They were not generals or heroes in medals, but without them, victory would have been impossible. Their legacy was not written in history books, but in steel, sweat, and sacrifice. June 6, 1944. The world remembers the beaches, Omaha's cliffs, Utah's sands, Gold, Juneau, and Sword splitting the dawn. But beneath the courage of those storming ashore lay a continent-sized industry that made invasion possible. The Normandy landings were not only a military plan, they were a logistical symphony conducted in factories, rail yards, and shipyards across the Atlantic. Months before the first boot hit sand, American factories had been pounding out landing craft, amphibious tractors, pontoon sections, and vehicles, the physical tools for moving men and material from sea to shore. Higgins Industries in Louisiana, which perfected the shallow draft landing craft, became one of the unsung heroes. Its LCVPs were the small, boxy vessels that hurled soldiers onto beaches under machine gun fire. In shipyards from Maine to California, landing ships, LSTs, were welded and fitted to carry tanks directly onto the beaches. Every rivet mattered. The air war above Normandy was America's industrial triumph made visible. Thousands of long-range bombers, B-17s and B-24s, had been produced by the tens of thousands, clearing the skies and cratering rail hubs, while fighters like the P-51, born of mass production genius, escorted them deep into enemy territory. Factories had produced the engines, propellers, guns, and radios that let Allied air forces dominate the day. And then there were the trucks, millions of them. The ubiquitous 212-ton Deuce and a Half and countless jeeps and fuel tankers moved men and fuel inland once the beachhead was secure. The pipeline across the English Channel, Pluto, fed fuel to advancing armor, but trucks carried the last mile. Behind every advancing division marched an industrial tail: spare parts, replacement crews, field repair units, and entire mobile workshops built in the United States. Across the vastness of the Pacific, the war was fought on water and atolls where supply meant life and delay meant death. America's industrial muscle transformed an endless ocean into a theater of operation by building carriers, destroyers, escort vessels, and the small landing craft that delivered men to reefs and reefs to victory. Shipyards along the coasts became assembly lines as disciplined as those on land. Kaiser, Bethlehem, and Newport News turned steel into floating fortresses. The aircraft carrier, once an experimental capital ship, became the instrument of strategy. American yards produced scores of them, each a city of aviators and mechanics. Carrier air groups, composed of planes constructed in Midwest and West Coast factories, struck enemy positions, provided close air support for amphibious landings, and shielded convoys from air attack. But the war in the Pacific demanded more than big ships. Amphibious doctrine relied on over 60,000 landing craft of various kinds to put troops onto coral islands and volcanic shores. The Higgins boats, LSTs, and DUKWs, the amphibious trucks, were mass-produced miracles of simple engineering. Their hulls didn't need elegance. They needed utility and speed of production. Beyond ships, engines, and planes mattered. The island-hopping campaign depended on air superiority. The P-47s and later P-51s, carrier-based Wildcats and Corsairs, all role-powered by American factories which delivered reliable power plants in record numbers. Aviation repair depots, often improvised on beaches and airstrips, kept damaged planes flying again. Engineers worked in mud and under fire to cannibalize parts, fabricate spares, and keep squadrons in the air. Logistics were staggering. Every Marine and soldier in the Pacific relied on canned rations, bottled water, medical supplies, and ammunition shipped thousands of miles. Cargo ships, the Liberty Fleet, became the backbone, and when U-boat threats were reduced, convoys moved with greater speed. The industrial chain reached into jungles, constructing temporary airfields in weeks, assembling prefabricated pontoon causeways and floating dry docks to repair ships away from home ports. Manufacturing saved lives in the Pacific the way it did in Europe, by sheer volume, speed, and adaptability. When Tarawa bled, when Iwo Jima chimed with artillery, it was the factories that ensured replacement troops, fresh ammunition, and repair crews arrived in time. Industry was the unseen flank that anchored victory across thousands of miles of ocean. Winning a war isn't only about guns and tanks, it's about keeping soldiers alive and mentally ready to fight. American industry tackled these soft elements with the same fervor as it did steel. Pharmaceuticals, field hospitals, bandages, chocolate bars, and even chewing gum were mass-produced. To maintain morale and health, the pharmaceutical industry scaled up production of antibiotics like sulfa drugs, the immediate precursors to penicillin's later widespread use, drastically reducing battlefield infections. Blood plasma, sterilized dressings, morphine syrettes, and other medical supplies were standardized and shipped in refrigerated units. Mobile surgical units were built and transported to forward bases, where medics worked around the clock. The survival rate of wounded soldiers improved dramatically thanks to fast evacuations and better surgical technology. Canned and preserved food, K rations, C rations, and D rations were engineered to be calorie-dense, compact, and logistically sensible. Nutritionists and engineers redesigned packaging to minimize weight and spoilage while maximizing energy. The small comforts mattered. Chocolate bars were issued not just for energy, but to lift spirits during cold nights or long marches. Clothing and shelter were also industrial triumphs. Blanket production, waterproof tarpaulins, and prefabricated Quonset huts arrived in the rear areas before many soldiers did, creating orderly camps where troops could rest and recover. The Quonset hut, with its corrugated steel shell and rapid assembly, served as barracks, offices, and field hospitals, a tiny piece of American industry that became omnipresent. Even morale-building items were industrial. Radios were mass-produced so that soldiers could hear news and music. Pocket-sized Bibles were printed by the thousands. Playing cards and cigarettes, controversial yet prevalent, were packed into care parcels. The USO, fed by industry and entertainment, sent shows constructed with stage sets, uniforms, and lighting that were the products of manufacturing know-how. Lastly, ordnance production wasn't only heavy. It involved the development and manufacturing of fuses, primers, and small components requiring precision. Ammunition plants turned out millions of rounds daily. The smallest part of a shell had to be flawless. The combined effect of medical, morale, and ordnance production turned the factories into life-preserving engines as well as killing machines. A paradox that ultimately underpinned survival on both sides of the battlefield. Industrial victory was inseparable from intellectual output. Science and industry merged into a hybrid engine that outpaced the Axis in innovation. Radar networks, code victory depended not only on producing new hardware but on maintaining the enormous fleets already in the field. Repair depots and mobile maintenance units were industrial wonders in their own right, transforming broken machines into combat-ready tools on a scale never before attempted. In North Africa, Sicily, and across Europe and the Pacific, the Army and Navy established echeloned repair systems. Field mechanics improvised fixes under fire. Rear area depots refurbished engines, replaced turrets, and rebuilt burned-out hulls. The depot at Antwerp, once liberated, became a critical hub for ship repairs, unloading supplies and patching vessels damaged by mines and shells. Aircraft maintenance was a science. Engines required precision overhauls, propellers needed balancing, and avionics had to be rewired to keep squadrons flying. Factories in the U.S. turned out spare parts in huge lots, but the ingenuity of maintenance crews often saved the day. Salvage units recovered wrecked vehicles and aircraft, cannibalized serviceable parts, and rapidly returned assets to the line. In the Pacific, floating dry docks and forward repair ships made it possible to fix destroyers and carriers without returning to home ports. These floating shipyards were feats of industrial logistics. Cranes, welding shops, foundries, and machine shops on water, staffed by civilians and Navy technicians. This art of maintenance, the unsung engineering backbone, meant that production was multiplied by preservation. Every repaired tank that returned to service was another victory won, and every hospital ship kept sailors alive to either return to duty or return home. The industrial chain that began with raw ore and ended with polished ordnance found its fullest expression in the tireless work of repair crews. In wartime America, factories were not anonymous boxes of steel. they became communities. Company towns swelled as workers relocated for jobs. Neighborhoods grew near plants, and cultures mixed in ways that would reshape American life. Company unions, worker councils, and on-site medical services emerged. Firms like Ford, Westinghouse, and Bethlehem Steel created worker programs, training, housing, and health services to keep labor productive and healthy. Industrial plants established nurseries and community centers to support the influx of women and migrant workers. The transition was seldom smooth, but the infrastructure built around factories had enduring social implications. Local colleges partnered with manufacturers to create training programs, speeding the onboarding of new employees. Apprenticeships expanded. Vocational schools grew, and with them, the skill base of the American workforce. Returning veterans took advantage of the GI Bill to further their education, turning wartime vocational experience into peacetime prosperity. The cultural life around factories was vivid. Songs and poems about shifts and rivets, religious services adapted to worker schedules, and recreational leagues formed by plant departments. This social architecture turned production lines into the social fabric of towns and cities, and when the war ended, it left behind a civilian workforce that was more organized, educated, and politically active. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 marked the end of global combat, but for industry, it was a beginning of transition. The monstrous war economy had to convert to peacetime production. Factories that built tanks and planes pivoted to cars and refrigerators, but not without pain and dislocation. Millions of wartime workers were laid off or demobilized. Cities that had relied on wartime contracts faced shrinking payrolls. Yet the GI Bill, suburban housing programs, and pent-up consumer demand created the engine for post-war growth. Many wartime innovations, prefabrication, mass production techniques, and supply chain management were redirected toward peacetime infrastructure, housing, and consumer goods. But the human costs lingered. Workers who had lost limbs or suffered trauma returned to communities that were changed forever. Racial tensions that had been suppressed by wartime necessity resurfaced, now in the light of demand for civil rights and equality. Women, pushed back into domestic roles, often found returning to pre-war life bitter. The expectation that their wartime labor would simply vanish was a social rupture. Politically, the state's wartime authority, price controls, allocation boards, and industrial directives was rolled back, but the new agencies and industrial leaders retained influence. The relationship between government and industry, forged in the fires of war, laid the groundwork for America's post-war economic leadership and Cold War military-industrial complex. When the last factory whistle blew on wartime shifts, it signaled more than the end of a conflict. It marked the birth of a new world order. America did not just win World War II on battlefields, it won with assembly lines, inventors' benches, and the tireless hands of workers who turned raw resources into the tools of victory. The scale of production redefined what a modern state could achieve. Mass production techniques matured into consumer manufacturing that lifted standards of living globally. The organizational lessons learned, project management at scale, supply chain logistics, and mobilized R&D would shape industries from aerospace to computing. Socially, the war forced change. Women proved their capability in technical work, accelerating conversations about gender roles, African Americans' wartime service, and industrial. Contributions fed the hunger for civil rights that would blossom in the 1950s and 60s. Immigrants and refugees who had contributed knowledge and labor became foundations for post-war innovation. Militarily, the idea of industrial base as a strategic asset became doctrine. Nations learned that victory required not just generals and tactics, but steel mills, shipyards, and an economy mobilized toward national goals. The Cold War would be fought on this premise. Above all, the war taught an enduring lesson. Organized, equitable, and technologically flexible production can outmatch brute force. The factories and people of America did not fight in foxholes, but they supplied the ones who did. Their legacy is the realization that in modern warfare, victory belongs as much to the builder as to the soldier, and when historians look back, they will see a nation transformed, scars etched into cities and hearts, but also a wealth of lessons that birthed an era of unparalleled innovation and growth. The furnaces cooled, the rivet guns fell silent, but the contours of the modern world were forged in that thunder, in the crucible where industry, imagination, and sacrifice met, and where victory was welded into being.